is our second annual Friends of Flight 93 speaker series. Huge success last year, so we're growing it more and more this year as well. So this is our first one of the summer. I'm Henry Scully. I'm the executive director of the Friends of Flight 93. You may have seen some brochures when you walked in. That's who we are, and there's some brochures in the back corner there. The Friends of Flight 93 is a 501c3 nonprofit that supports the National Park Service here at Flight 93. We help raise volunteers, we help put on events like this in conjunction with the National Park Service, and we raise funds for the park in terms of things that they can't raise funds for, in terms of maybe more trees or trails or whatever's needed. So please consider becoming a member if you'd like. Look at the brochure, go on our website, or also please consider being a volunteer, like wonderful Sheena Baker in the back corner there, who's on our board. She comes several hours every weekend and just greets people and tells them a little bit about the story. So we'd love to have you. Today we're fortunate to have Wally Miller and Dennis Dirkmaat on our panel. These two gentlemen were the first civilians, as Tom McMillan told me, to have access to the crash site. So their perspectives on that day are few that others have. Wally Miller, Somerset coroner, funeral director, all of a sudden that morning was thrust in to this tragedy and became the point person for the family members, which was so important. Representing them in so many ways, Wally oversaw the crash site and helped family members organize the Families of Flight 93, which is still a strong group and an active board. Dennis Dirkmaat is a forensic anthropologist who worked on site at Flight 93 that day and for several weeks to follow. Dennis is the chair of Applied Forensic Services at Mercyhurst University. Dennis served as the primary scientific advisor to Wally during the recovery and identification of victims of United Flight 93. These two gentlemen have known each other even before 9/11/01. Dennis told me this morning that he did work for Wally's father, and so these guys go way back and a real team. I'll start with Wally. Wally, please walk through the audience regarding what you saw when you first arrived at the crash site of Flight 93, and what you expected and what you were surprised to see or not see.
Well, before I answer that question, I want to tell you that Dennis was the first person I called. My office is in Somerset, and of course this is maybe 12 or 14 miles away. So I knew when I was going to go out there that there was going to be a large scene there that was well beyond anything that I could control. So I called him right away. It was hard because around Somerset you couldn't make an outgoing phone call. You could make outgoing, but you couldn't get an incoming call because all the lines got jammed somehow. I don't know how. But I called him up because I knew that he was probably going to get called to go up to the World Trade Center because, was that probably accurate? Because he was part of the DMOR crew, which we can talk about a little bit later. But I wanted to get him before he went up there because I figured I was going to need help out here. And it turned out to be a good move because I really did need help. When I got out there, I got met by a couple of state troopers down here on Lambertsville Road. They escorted me in around, there used to be a road that came through here called Skyline Road. Does everybody know about all that? Or is it's all gone now, I guess? Because this whole site has been re-engineered to be something different. The only thing that's the way it was back then is anything that's on the other side of that black stone wall down there, that's the way it was whenever we left it. All this material out here has been changed dramatically over the years. But anyway, we drove down around there, which would now be down where you walk into that entryway, where you walk under that concrete thing that looks like the tree bark. And forgive me, I'm not nearly as erudite as Dennis. I'm just an elected hick, but he's actually a professor, so he'll do better than me. But I walked around down under there, and a couple of troopers brought me up through the trees. And I kept saying to them, well, where's this crash? And they said, well, this is it. You're walking right through it. I said, no, because I figured I would see pieces of fuselage and big engine debris and things like that. But there wasn't anything like that I saw. As we walked up through that tree area, I just saw thousands and thousands of small pieces of aircraft debris that had been shattered. And the thing that sticks in my mind to that day was, to this day, was I could smell jet fuel everywhere. You could just, there was like this pervasive aroma of jet fuel. And then I could hear plastic dripping out of the trees. You could hear this melted plastic coming down and kind of sizzling when it hit the ground. And boy, I'll tell you, that's something I can hear it even now, just sitting here describing it to you. So, never being involved in any kind of an airline crash, I didn't have any idea of how it was going to unfold. I knew that we had a lot of people out there from Somerset County who just happened to be in the area that came out there. But once the FBI and the state police arrived, they kind of moved everybody back. They set up a perimeter. And whenever you have a case like this, anytime you have any kind of a fatality where you have to have a police investigation, you have to let it kind of the way it is. You can't just walk in there and start picking things up. You got to let everything there so it can be documented. And that was when we called Dennis, and he got up here maybe a couple hours later. And from that point, I knew that he had a lot of experience with airline crashes. Maybe he can go through some of the things that he did that got him qualified, so to speak, for this. Because the biggest airplane crash I ever had in Somerset County was I had a twin-engine experimental airplane go down out here at Somerset Airport a couple years ago. And well, it was a couple years before September 11th, and there were 2 fatalities. The NTSB was involved. It was wrapped up in a day or 2, but I could see that this wasn't going to happen this time.
That's a good segue, Dennis, if you can tell us what your responsibilities were.
Yes, on that morning, I'd gone to my office and just starting the day. So I had a number of students, undergraduates that were working in the labs, and one of the graduate students said that there was a plane that hit the World Trade Center, and I remembered earlier, I think it was Thurman Munson or so, there was a little plane that hit it, and so no big deal. But then once we started watching the news, saw it was certainly a huge event. And as we watched that, heard reports of a plane going down in western Pennsylvania and then eventually Somerset. And I remember talking to our graduate students, say, let's get prepared, Wally's going to be calling. I do forensic anthropology, and we provide services for coroners and law enforcement when they find skeletal remains or human remains in outdoor settings. So I've done that for nearly 30 years, including cases for Wally's dad Wilbur for many years before that, and then when Wally took over, did many cases for him. So we knew that he would need us to help out. So there was never any option to go to New York or anything like that, so you needn't worry about that. And so we got into the vehicle and came down. We may have been speeding or so, I'm not sure, but we had a reason to be. And so when we came onto the scene, met with Wally, one of the first tasks was just to see the extent of the plane crash and how far afield the debris was. I had been through our forensic anthropology work and working with the police. We're experts in how to deal with scenes that include 1 or 2 individuals. But I was involved in 1994 in a crash in Pittsburgh, US Air Flight 427. And so I was for the first time there, we were mapping that scene using electronic mapping instruments. That was the first time that it had ever been used. But I also saw that there was a need to sort of organize better the processing of a scene like that, to make sure that you get all of the evidence in its proper location, you know where it comes from. Those are sort of basic basic central tenets of outdoor scenes is to know where they're coming from, establish chain of custody and all that. And so I had done some research, including mock scenes that we did down in Columbus, Ohio, and in St. Louis. And so we had published on some protocols to deal with a big crash scene. And so Wally was familiar with that. And so we responded there, and the role initially was to set up the recovery process for Wally, just to make sure that we figured out how big the scene was, and we made sure that we collected all the evidence in its proper place. And so that was the role coming in.
Wally, tell us, working with the agencies, the state police, FBI, how did all that go? Be honest.
Don't be honest.
Well, you have to understand this doesn't work. I hate this.
If you read the county code of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which is really what, it's the legal basis that gives any coroner or medical examiner in Pennsylvania, it gives them the basis of what allows them to take control of a scene or be responsible for a scene. And according to the county code, if there are human remains on a crime scene, the coroner is the chief law enforcement, if you will, agent on that scene. Therefore, he would have the ability to keep anybody else out if they wanted to, or invite anybody else in if he wanted to. But what happened here, the FBI kind of got involved, and the Justice Department got involved right away. And the reason for that was, I'm going to guess, was there was an interstate crime committed which made it a felony. I think it's a felony to hijack an airplane. And these were all things that we didn't know anything about that day. All we knew was that a jet crashed right here. And as Dennis came in, I'm used to working with the Pennsylvania State Police. They canvass about 75% of Somerset County, and this is part of their area. So they came out from the Somerset Barracks right away, and they have what they call Forensic Services Unit, which is in Greensburg for their particular troop out of the PSP. And they mustered up all their total stations, and they had 4 or 5 of them, I believe. And they came out, and Dennis, of course, was used to working with them too. So this all transpired in maybe the first 3 or 4 hours right after you got there. And we started mapping out that scene the way he was taught to do, and the way we all did through all of our continuing education. Now, not me. I just stood up there going, "Oh, whoa, what are we going to do?" But that's why I needed to have the people around that knew what they were doing. However, when the FBI arrived, they kind of cleared everybody out of the scene. What are you going to do? Say no? Just to give you a little perspective, there was a dirt road. You can't really see it from where you're at up here whenever you're looking down there, but there's a little dirt road that went down into the crash site there. And I wish we had photos of it, but it was dirt, and it was dusty out there for a couple of days. It didn't rain for a couple of days, and there was dust everywhere. And they got tired of driving their black vehicles down that dirt road, and they paved all the area around the command post down into that road, into the crash site, and it cost like $96,000 to pave this road. And you might say, well, $96,000, that's not that much. They spent millions and millions of dollars. Well, my budget, the Somerset County Coroner's Office budget in the year 2001, which included all the autopsies I did, all the toxicology, my salary, my health care, everything was $68,000. So they spent more money paving a road than my whole budget was. So you could see, and that was before we even did anything. So you can see the enormous amount of money and manpower that was going to be needed for this case. They brought in, what would you say? I think at one point there was close to 300 or 400 state police in this area. They wound up being security, and we set up a temporary morgue facility over at the Freedom's Airport, and that was the Somerset County Airport, which I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. That was where we stored all the items later. But there's an armory out there. The Pennsylvania National Guard had a big armory. And my old high school basketball coach happened to be the commander at the time. And I said, hey, Hank, we're going to come over there and use we're going to use that armory. And he said, well, no, you can't do that. We have weddings and stuff over there. I said, don't worry, we'll clean it up when we leave. So he let us in, and that was how everything kind of evolved in that way. But we were taken aback a little bit at the beginning because we had confidence and faith in the PSP, Forensic Services Unit, but we were told that it was going to take too long to do that. Do you agree with all that so far? Feel free to edit me at any point.
I'm going to interject.
That's never good.
Thought I was.
That's never good. When an intellectual interjects, you know you're in trouble.
In an incident like this, National Transportation Safety Board is in charge. They have to determine what is the cause of the accident, whether it's mechanical or pilot, or their main task is to determine that. If it's an accident, they take the lead on the investigation. However, if there is criminal intent, then the FBI takes the lead and the NTS becomes secondary. So those are two of the main characters, players in this project like this. The other one is the coroner's office, or the medical examiner. Again, as Wally said, they are in charge of victim identification, as well as, and a lot of coroners don't realize that, but they're also in charge of victim recovery, making sure that all the remains are collected properly, etc.
And also the personal effects. They're responsible for the personal effects.
They're responsible for the personal effects. And there was a lady that came to us like the first day, and she said, my aunt had $5 million worth of jewelry on that airplane. What? So it turned out not to be true, but those are the kind of things that got dropped on me right away, and I'm like, I didn't have any experience dealing with any of this at all. So everything that I did was kind of like new ground, especially for somebody who, like Cyril Wecht is fond of saying, we're lay coroners. I'm a lay coroner. I'm just a guy that got elected to do something. And it was a challenge, so I had to rely on him. So go ahead, I'm relying on you now.
Dennis, if you could tell us about the process of collecting things and what you found and all that, would be very interesting.
In terms of outdoor forensic scenes, the key is to document the evidence in place, because what we're trying to do is reconstruct what happened in the past at that scene. And so it requires steps that we can call forensic archaeology, noting it, documenting it, collecting it, and then interpreting how material is distributed.
So, ask one question.
Yes.
Can you give me a sense of timeline here? When you do this stuff, is it like the next day, the morning, a week later?
Typically, like at Mercyhurst, we have a program where the state police or the local coroner can give us a call, and I can send out a team.
So if this thing comes down, bang, on the ground, how quickly are you there and doing stuff and blah, blah, blah?
Well, Wally's on scene.
Right.
He calls us, we get in the vehicle, and then I'm walking the scene about 3 o'clock. So then we're trying to figure out how to do that. In a normal forensic scene, an outdoor scene, we'll respond within hours or the next day, and we always like to have a lot of light. So my research into something big like this, the process is essentially dividing it up into reasonable areas and then sending in teams that search. We use what we call a straight line pedestrian search. We search it very carefully, make sure we find everything, flag it, and then we have a team that comes in and documents through a total station, through other types of mapping instruments, and then it's collected, and so that we go systematically through the site. If we do that, then we have a pretty good idea of how long it'll take, etc.
I'm just going to shout.
Okay.
There's 3 different types of things we were looking for. We were not just searching for human remains. We're also looking for personal effects and aircraft debris, because you're looking for things that would indicate, I didn't want to give everybody the impression that we were only looking for human remains. We're looking for everything, but those are the three main categories.
Right, and during the search, obviously the NTSB is interested in finding evidence of why the plane went down, whether it's instrument dial or the rudder of a plane like 427. There was an issue there, and so they're involved in the process. The law enforcement is documenting personal effects, parts of the plane, etc. So the process is basically going systematically through it, and we note exactly where everything is going, where it's coming from, and so that is the process that we use on our scenes that involve one or two individuals. It is what we were going to use on bigger scenes like the 427, and we initially set up to do that systematically. We had basically 5 or 6 total stations, and so 5 or 6 teams could go in and work independently, and so it would be we have noted that it's a pretty efficient, a very effective system. But since it wasn't an accident, it was terrorist activity and criminal intent, then the FBI became in charge of that, and so they have their own set of protocols.
Now, can you tell us how this site was different versus New York and Washington, D.C. in terms of this being a reclaimed mine, and that impacted I understood the FBI and state police, you all found things like a credit card from the terrorists, and they didn't find those things in Washington and New York. Can you tell us about the differences?
Well, some of the differences would be the fire that's associated with those big ones, and the other one is that in this particular case, we're talking about a reclaimed strip mine. It doesn't look like a big hole, but it used to be a big hole, and so it was filled in, and so the soil is softer, and when the plane came in, it hit sort of the edge of that bowl and sort of bounced down in, and so a lot of the plane was sitting in the ground. Part of the fuselage, and we could see some of the engines and some of the wheels were off into the woods, but a lot of the material was buried into the ground, unlike the other incidents where it hit structures, burned significantly, and so it was a little bit of a different type of scene.
Another issue was, in most of the scenes he's talking about, they happen near an airport where a plane is decelerating, coming in for landing. I think 427 was coming in for a landing, and the rudder fell off, or the tail or something went down. This aircraft was not slowing down. It was actually more than cruising speed. It would go at people at 30,000 feet. The terrorists they weren't really trying to be a pilot. They just brought it down underneath what they felt was radar detection area, and that's why they kept it low. So when that plane hit the ground, it hit the ground harder and faster than a lot of other crashes.
Right. They calculated 560 miles per hour. The crash in Pittsburgh, in which there was a rudder malfunction, it went down in about 30 seconds and was going about the same amount. And so in terms of the effects on the plane and the human victims, it's very comparable. I was also involved with a crash up in Buffalo in 2009, in which the plane basically stalled, and so it hit the house about 150 miles an hour. So considerably different impact on the plane and the individuals in there. And so this one, these two, Flight 427 in Pittsburgh and 93 were very similar.
So we wound up getting, there was a lot more fragmentation of the human remains than what you can see in a plane crash where it was a smaller miles per hour. A guy from the Sledgick NTSB at the time?
Yes.
He told me that a lot of times, a lot of these crashes you'll have more intact remains because the people are seated. And whenever they hit an impact point, all of those chairs just kind of, they collapse on each other. So a lot of those torsos remain intact. So, but that didn't happen here for a couple of reasons. A, we don't think anybody was actually in their chair. And B, if they're all in the front or they're all in the back, wherever they were, when that plane went down, we were told by a guy that, and these are these experts that came in, of which he was one, of course, but they said the tail came through the front end of the plane in half of a second. So in a 757, all the galley material's in the back. That's where all the knives and forks and coffee pots and all that stuff's in the back, and it just went that way through it. So if you happen to be there, everything's going to be coming through you really fast. Like really fast.
Can you gentlemen tell us about when you first met some of the family members here, what day it was, and obviously not any of them were from Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The party was going from Newark to San Francisco, so more East Coast, West Coast. But can you tell me about Wally and Dennis, your first experience and when they started showing up?
Well, if I could start off, my role was dealing with the scene as well as then in the morgue trying to complete victim identification. So I really had no interactions with the families at all.
Let me qualify that, though. He actually did later on because, I don't know how much time we're going to have to get into it. The FBI, we were talking about things that the FBI was looking for. They were looking for the black box, okay? The flight data recorder and the voice cockpit. That's what they really wanted. And when they found that, they initially, I'm not disparaging the FBI. They did fantastic work as far as going out and getting DNA material from these next of kin. They located next of kin. Those people were outstanding. But when they came in here originally, they said, well, we're going to be here about 6 weeks processing this scene. They found the black boxes in 2 weeks, and the next day they left. So, look, I'm not disparaging, that's just how it is. So, when they left, and that's a part, we need to get into that part of the discussion because that's where we really became the people who processed that scene. And then that was an operation that was only going for about 18 months. So what happened was when they left, I was left with a team of people that I had around me because I learned real fast. I made a couple of statements to the media that I never should have made. If you Google my name, the first 150 hits are part of some conspiracy theory because they said, well, what did it look like? I said, well, it almost looked like they dropped the people off somewhere and just wrecked the plane somewhere. My point was, I was this hick, overwhelmed by the fact that I couldn't see much in the way human remains. And I've been on hundreds of vehicle crashes and fires and everything else, and I knew what it was, but I never saw anything like that. So this rube got educated real quick. So after that, then I had guys like this around me who could really help me to make those kind of statements. In fact, those first 2 weeks that the FBI was here, they had press conferences every day, and we're not used to that. They quit going out. They sent Dennis and I out every time, so we wound up having to talk to everyone. And that was how we kind of, we got into the public eye due to the fact that we were just the only guys that were sent out there to talk to people. So that was kind of what happened. And then later on, whenever these family members started coming in, I kept him as part of my team because whenever we had the first anniversary when we let 500 people walk around in there when we felt we had it cleaned up enough, he was there. So he actually did interact with a lot of family members, just not what he's telling you about right now. He was part of it the whole way through. Everybody knew about him. And that's one big beef that I have about this project. If you go in there, you don't see his name there, and they should. His name should be there ahead of mine. But that's just how it is, That's just the way things unfold sometimes. It's like there's Confederate generals that didn't know what they were doing. The brilliant guys don't get it. Pickett's charge is named after Pickett, but he didn't do it. That's how it was here.
Here's Wally's legacy. He's a funeral director, coroner of a relatively small rural county, and so he doesn't see this type of stuff. But he's smart enough to understand people and know people that are going to give you the proper information and not BS you and all that. And so I was, as I said, involved with Flight 427 in Pittsburgh, and working in the victim identification and doing that. The individuals that came in to help that coroner, who was also inexperienced in a small county, he was told, don't interact with the families at all, because that'll only be problems. And so the families were made to wait for 2 weeks until they got information. And so they weren't very happy about that. And so even to this day, however many years later, there are still lawsuits. Wally was, I think, given the same advice to, oh, you don't want to get involved. And he said, no, I'm a funeral director, that's what I do. And so from day one, he interacted with the families and said, whatever you want to know, I'll tell you. I'm not holding anything back. I'll never lie to you, and et cetera. And so the families appreciated that. And so when Wally talks about coming back a year later, this was a celebration. This wasn't, we're going to string Wally up because he was a terrible coroner, didn't interact with us. He was a beloved character. And so he saw right away that the thing to do is to interact with the families. That's the most important thing, and that's where his interpersonal skills come into play.
I can see what was going to happen. Now kind of getting back to the question, I guess. We don't have a script, by the way, if you haven't. But when family members started coming in right away, and they were out at Seven Springs. That was where they had this family command center, and it was essentially run by the Red Cross. And let me tell you, as this whole thing unfolded over 18 months, I got a lot of pushback. The FBI didn't give me any trouble much about anything, but I got a lot of pushback from United Airlines and from the Red Cross, because they didn't want me to talk to these people. If any of you work for United, God bless you, whatever. But, because a lot of people came out here that did work. But they got in, they got into our, they wanted to be part of that whole interaction with family members so that they could keep a lid on things, because they correctly ascertained that they were going to get sued. In fact, now, back in the day, I don't know how I look out at the crowd, I see that there's a lot of people that are kind of my age or maybe older, but back in the day, you got in an airplane, you just showed them things, you put your bags in, you sat down the plane. Not anymore, because that's why, because of this. Not just this, but the whole September 11th scenario. When I went out there about the second or third day, and I said, hey, I'm getting everybody together in one of these auditoriums, and I'm going to tell them everything that we know so far, and have them ask these questions. And the guy from the Red Cross says, well, you don't want to do that. They're emotionally upset, and you shouldn't talk to them. And they need to talk to psychiatrists, and they need to talk to religious people. And I said, you know what? That's bull crap. If this was my daughter, and she got killed in Kankakee, Illinois, and I wanted to go out there, I would say, where's my daughter? Where's her stuff? How do I get a death certificate? How do I open an estate? And what do I do to get her home? That's what I wanted. And that's what these people wanted to know. So they wouldn't let me, they actually wouldn't let me have that big meeting. I just wanted to have them in a big room just like this. So we got a room, and we threw it out to anybody that wanted to come visit us. They could come as a family. So maybe a third of them actually did show up and come. And then the rest of them, like I said, the FBI found out, see, this is a touchy situation, because you, as the coroner, you have to deal with the legal next of kin. You can't be talking to second cousin Claude or somebody's live-in girlfriend. That's not how it works. And people get mad at me for that all the time. But I follow the letter of the law. That's what I got elected to do. So what we did, I got everybody's phone number, and then I started getting on the phone and calling these people. I was talking to people out in California. They'd call me, it'd be 11 o'clock at night out there. Well, it'd be 2 a.m. in Somerset. Well, they'd call up, and I'd talk to them, because nobody else would talk to them. So back a good period of time went by, and I decided I was going to get everybody together up in Newark, New Jersey, because nobody was giving them any information. And nobody talks about this meeting. I don't want to take all your time, but I told the NTSB. I got on a conference call with the NTSB, and I just want to use this little story to illustrate it to you. Red Cross, United Airlines, and the FBI. It was a conference call. I said, first I went to the commissioners of Somerset County. I said, I'm going out there and I'm having a meeting. I don't know how I'm going to fund it, but I'm going to do it. I want you to help me fund it. They thought I had PTSD and thought I needed to go see a shrink. Oh, well, okay, then they're not going to help, obviously. So I got on a conference call with those people. Because what had happened was, I thought Neil Young wrote a song called Let's Roll about Todd Beaton, okay? And I was going to call Neil Young and have him come out, either donate the money or come out and play like a benefit concert to get the money to get these people to Newark, New Jersey. And I really got all the way up to his publicist when finally a lady from the United Way in Pittsburgh called me up. She said, hey, Wally, we got $150,000 here that people just donated out of the goodness of their heart. What do you want to do with it? And I'm like, well, I got a job for you. So they did it. They put all that together. So I went to this conference call and I said, I'm having a meeting and they're going to come. The Red Cross said, nah, they're not going to come. I said, you watch. They're going to come. And I said, will you help me? They said, no, we're not going to help you because nobody ever did it before. I said, well, after I do it, there's going to be one guy that did it. And I said, furthermore, I'm going to tell them that you didn't help whenever I do. And they all laughed and hung up. What they didn't know was I talked to everybody on the phone and asked them first if they were going to come. I talked to Lisa Beamer. She said she was going to come. I talked to Liz Glick. She said she was going to come. Bingham's mother. I had everybody ready to go. So, and you're going to see about all them in there. They're all in there. And they should be, because that's what it's really all about. But we had that meeting, and then all of a sudden, United Airlines, they paid to fly them in, and Red Cross provided the food, and they did all this. So all I'm saying is, that's where I really started to get irritated, because I didn't give them cooperation, but I knew what the people needed, because I got on the phone and talked to them. Now, they couldn't do it at the World Trade Center, because there was too many people. I figured with 40 passengers and crew, I could handle it, and somehow I did. So, sorry, it took about 10 minutes.
That's perfect. And we have about 5 or 10 minutes more, and then we'll have some questions you all can ask. So, Dennis, what would you like to add from your findings and your experience and all that so we can get that side?
Well, I think we've covered. And we don't need to get into the weeds about how we did it or anything like that. I think in terms of not only the field recover, we had a pretty good plan in place. We didn't get to execute it as one, but one thing that we did in this particular incident is the morgue, the temporary morgue that we set up, the protocols that we followed for victim identification worked very well. It was one of the first times that we had it that well organized, and basically when the FBI was recovering material from the scene and documenting it and then sending it to the morgue after a morning, then we would process and identify those remains in the afternoon. And so while they're collecting in the afternoon, we'd do the next morning. And so as it turned out, the FBI finished on one morning 2 weeks later. We had the remains in the temporary morgue that afternoon, and we finished up that day. So it showed me that it was a very, very efficient process and serves as a model for how to do these types of incidents in the future.
But we did have to go back and make some secondary recoveries. He's not telling you that. He ramrodded all that. We had to go back there. Once they left, we had to go back with any volunteers that we could muster. We used National Guard people, we used Boy Scouts, we used Region 13 terror people, and he did that, and then he came back and processed all those remains too.
Yeah, we had some. I had some issues with how some of the material was being collected, and that was just me. And so So after the FBI released the scene and they were done processing it, the process would be turning it over to Wally, who would give it back to the families and et cetera. And so the people in the morgue had not been on the scene, and so we decided to bring them out just to get a sense of the place. And when Wally and I and a coroner from the neighboring county of Cambry, we went out, and there were piles of dirt that had been collected from the hole where the plane was, and expected not to find anything, but we found something. And so Wally said, we can't release the scene. So we spent months, on weekends working to further process the scene and hands and knees and things like that. And so we did find materials. We're talking about a scene in which debris and parts of the plane and human remains are scattered over almost 80 acres. And so it's a difficult task. And if you look down there, you can see the coniferous trees there, in which, as the plane hits and debris goes up in the air, it's deposited in places where we have very difficult times finding them. And so the process after it was released was a very good one, and we found a lot of material, but it wasn't going to end. And Wally actually retained control of that scene. He didn't, the next weekend, release it. He retained it for 5 years, longer?
About 5 years.
About 5 years before was confident. We had gone back numerous times to search and et cetera.
And then also, after we finally identified everybody. It took about, it was March of the next year until everyone was identified. And we only about 65% of the material we recovered was considered unidentifiable. And by that, I can say that, we talked about this a little last night, DNA testing is not as, it's much better today than it was back in 2001. So they came in, DNA people came in and they determined what things they could use that were suitable for a sample size. So we had all this material that we couldn't return to the families. So he stuck around with his team and we processed every item and we wound up with, I don't know, hundreds, thousands really, of individual samples that we stacked in caskets. And then we kept those 3 caskets in a mausoleum up in Wimber for several years. And then in 2010, we had a little service down here where we reinterred those right where the plane hit the ground. And to me, that was the closing, that was the part of the episode that closed it for me, because I told those family members down in Newark that day, I said, the day is going to come when I'm not going to be here to do it for you. You're going to have to get organized and do it on your own. And they did, and that's when they started to negotiate with the Park Service and Somerset County and everything else. And finally on that day, I brought everybody back that was involved in the case. And we had pallbearers for these 3 caskets. The state troopers did one, the FBI guys were there, they did one, and then my team of guys had the other. So that was a period of closure for me. And I stood up there that day and I said, hey, that day has arrived. And it did, and I'm done. And there's been other things that have occurred since then that they wanted me to be involved in. Look, I didn't get elected by Somerset County to be on some board in Washington, D.C. I got elected to take care of people that pass away in Somerset County. And that's what I do, and that's what we did. He was a big part of that the whole way through, and that was what I think, you don't want to say that there was a successful conclusion to the case of something of this magnitude, but from our perspective, we felt like we did everything that we could do with the constraints that were put on us, A, by my lack of astuteness, and B, by just the lay of the land back at that time.
Thanks, Wally. One last point that I want to bring up before questions is this community, Somerset and surrounding communities, were just wonderful in terms of their response and what they did and how they could help with this surprising tragedy that no one knew how to handle. Wally, if you can just comment on these wonderful people in your township, your county, et cetera, and how they responded.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I don't really know that much about it. Because what I do remember is it was a rare time in American history since I've been alive, and I grew up, I'm a hippie, still am. But I grew up in a time of great social turbulence. And this was a rare time. Think of it now. Think of what it's like now. That's all been lost. Which, incidentally, the FBI director at the time was none other than Robert Mueller of the Russian investigation thing. But the point is, there was a brief period of time when you drove out Route 281 past that temporary morgue and you were coming out here, there was just American flags the entire length of it. I mean, people were flying flags off of their cars, and it was emotional. And people, my wife was a big part of this project. We had a little office up the courthouse that was full of people would just send us cards and letters and just encouraging us and everything, because we were on TV every day, being overwhelmed. And it was just thousands and thousands of letters and stuff that came in, and we were just amazed at all this support that we got. And you could actually feel that. You could kind of feel that wave, and then it gradually dissipated, as all things do. But that was a major part of it. The thing that stuck in my mind the whole time, and I knew that I had to worry about it. In my mind, there was two groups of people that I was really worried about. A, these family members, because they treated them, when I say they, I mean pretty much everybody except us, they treated them like they were a group, like they knew each other, like they were some kind of club. No, they were random guys on an airplane. Half of them had fractured families. So you had to get all of them together as a unit to bargain. And the other group that I was really worried about were the people who live out here in Stony Creek Township. Because we had no idea what was going to occur out here, except I got a little bit ahead of the curve, because a guy from the, what do they call it, the Conservancy, the American Conservancy. For some reason, the Park Service isn't allowed to buy ground directly from a landowner. Is that correct? So they had this intermediary guy, he came through, he said to me, he said, you know, and he had a daughter killed in the Lockerbie crash, if you recall. That one was at 87 or something like that. And the first thing he said was, it was really positively influenced by your handling of this case. I said, well, thanks. And then he said, this is going to be a national park. And that's extremely unusual and rare. He said, usually for something to become a national memorial or a national monument or park, it takes 150 years and everybody's dead. This is going to be up in 10 years. And I'm like, you got to be out of your mind. He said, no, it's going to be, trust me. Well, it was. It was there. So I knew that these family members had to get together so that they could have their say in what went into it. And they did. And I think that talk about a legacy of the case, I think that's what it is. But, and McMillan made an interesting point. That's why you folks sitting here, this is a really unusual thing for people that come to a memorial to see something. It's rare that you see the guys that were actually involved. Like when you go to Antietam, General Lee's dead. But we're here, you know. And, it's interesting that you have the ability to experience that. And, you know, in another few years, we're going to be dead too. And we come out, they'll see our picture. If I have anything to say about it, they will.
No, that's great. And a lot of our ambassadors and greeters and all that you see in the back of their green jackets with their name tags, many of them were here on the first day, and they just volunteered and just showed up at the temporary memorial where the fence is, where people left flags and things like that. So they've been here for many years. That's why we need more volunteers. Not that we're getting any younger, but that's another way you can ask somebody and they said, yeah, I was here on the second day, and it doesn't happen again.
The best part was nobody starved. They had a command post up there. You can still see where it is. They took everything out now. I think they have a little plaque there or something. Every group, like PSP was there, everybody but the FBI, because everybody, like Shanksville Fire Company and PSP, and just all these different guys, they all had their own little trailer out there. But all the wives and significant others, they all brought food out. So it was like going to a fair. You could walk around and eat different kinds of food all the way around. When you went to the temporary ward, the Salvation Army had a canteen over there. So I never drank so much coffee in my whole life.
Well, thank you, man. I want to open it up to some questions before we have to shut down. Yes, the lady in the back in yellow.
Wally, I'm Joan Smeltzer, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker with critical incidents training.
Uh-oh, I'm gonna get help.
And no. What I want to say to you is, what you did was so important to those families. So many people don't realize how important those kinds of issues are. And so, kudos to you for getting those people to Seven Springs and Newark. That's the kind of stuff that I think, I don't want to say, sometimes people have too much education and they're trying to do it out of the book rather than doing it from the heart. And I think that's, again,
Well, that's kind of what, if you haven't figured it out, I'm kind of an emotional soul. That's why I need guys like Dennis around to kind of reel me in a little bit. And that's what he's kind of done for me in my whole career. I owe a lot to him. He mentioned Denny Kwiatkowski, the coroner here in the county. Between those two is really how I learned to be a coroner. Just from being around them and going to their courses and stuff like that. Because other than that, I'm a funeral director. You don't need to be no genius to do that.
Buy $5 million for it.
No! I'll tell you one thing though that we did do.
We don't know that.
Well, but here's what happened. We put together a catalog with everything in it. I mean, if we found shoes and belt buckles and cufflinks, whatever we found, it went into a catalog and it went out to these next kids. There would be rings where 5 different families would play with rings. What are you going to do with that? So we had to get them together. Well, yeah, you had to sort it out a little bit. Those are the kind of things that we really had to be careful with. And, it's like anything else. You have, and I know from being in the funeral home and also in coroner's case, everybody's different. Everybody reacts to something different. Some people you connect with, some you don't. You just have to be able to read that, fly by the seat of your pants, and try to make sure that that person gets what they perceive that they need.
Any questions? Yes.
You mentioned the emotional. Isn't it difficult for you two gentlemen to come and speak for an hour on this, on the emotional side?
Well, I'm often asked that. Because I do a lot of forensic cases where we find remains out in the woods, and the backstory on how they ended up there is often pretty heinous. But I learned a valuable lesson for Flight 427 in Pittsburgh. I grew up in Pittsburgh. I would come home from the morgue or from the scene and then watch the news, and then they would have personal stories about these individuals and all that, and then I would read about it, and I said, I can't do that anymore. My job is not to grieve for the families. My job is to the best of my ability, to identify the victims and their remains. And so I have to set that part aside. That's not my job. And I working for the families, benefit the families by doing a good scientific job of identifying the victims. He's a funeral director, so he would deal more with that.
Yeah, I'm pretty emotional anyway. So for me, it was just, it took me a while. Whenever I'd see these people, like the people on the West Coast, I'd talk to them on the phone every day. And when we had that meeting over in Newark, for most of them, it was the first time I ever saw them in person. So to actually see them after having spoken to them on the phone all that time, it was a very emotional time. That's just part of who I am. That isn't something that you really want to talk a lot about. It just kind of happens and comes about.
Any other questions? Please go ahead.
In this area, correct? Can you talk a little bit about how you reacted to the actual document being built?
I don't know very much about it because, like I said, they wanted me to, when I say they, I don't even know who they are. They were just the guys who built this. I don't know who they were. But people wanted me, some of the family members did too, they had a commission that did all this, is that right? They had a commission where they had all these different people. There was some guy named Ed Linenthal, I think his name was. He wrote a book about the Oklahoma City bombing or something. He was some kind of an expert. He was one of the guys. They had a couple family members, and they were always going down to D.C. to have meetings, and they were trying to get congressional money and all this different stuff. And I said, hey, look, like I told you, that's not what I do. My job is to work for Somerset County, the same guys that accused me of having PTSD. It took me a while to get over that, but maybe I do. You know, I don't know. My hair didn't get gray. But I tell you, I think that there was a lot, and like I said, there was a lot of apprehension out here because I don't think they realized, I think they were afraid that it was going to take on a scenario that, don't get mad at me, but like Gettysburg, where you have the souvenir shops pushing right up against what it is. But I don't think that as it finally evolved, that didn't really happen. I don't think they had to make a lot of zoning changes or anything out here. This is a pretty remote area. You know, I got to be honest. I'm shocked at what they finally did. It's really nice. It was more than what I ever thought of. But when they came in, they came to me when they started building this thing. Well, what do you think about this or that? And I said, I don't care what you do over here on this side. They had that wall down there. I said, anything on that side of the wall, you have to treat like a cemetery. Because of what he said, we did not recover all those remains. There was a significant portion of those remains that got kind of, is it correct to say vaporized? I mean, they were vaporized. They were consumed on impact by the explosion and all that. So it's a cemetery. You can't mess with that.
Whose land was all this?
There were 7 different landowners. The main part here was owned by a coal company called PBS, which I believe are now defunct. I don't remember what they were. But, they owned the area there where the big cranes were and where the plane hit the ground. But down in below there, where the 80 acres that he was talking about in the evergreen trees, there was like 6 different landowners. And what had happened was this one guy, his name's Tim Lambert, he wound up becoming pretty good friends with me. His grandfather built a bunch of little cabins down in there. And they sold them off in little parcels and people were using them for like summer homes and stuff like that. So they had to get that land from them. And, you know, different of those people had different ideas about what they should do with that land. I convinced Lambert to donate some of his ground and give it to the family so that they had a bargaining chip, and he did it. But there were others who wanted $50 million. So it wound up. Some of them had to, the government actually had to condemn some of the land and kind of take it from them by eminent domain. Others negotiated, you know, in good faith. Look, I'm not here to disparage anybody. That's why I stayed the heck out of it, because I knew them all. And I buried 3 of the 6. I buried members of their family. So if you think I'm getting involved in that kind of a fight,
Tim Lambert is speaking here at our later on in the summer.
Yeah, come hear him. He's really
speaking with Dennis Roddy, who wrote for the Post-Gazette.
And he's an interesting guy. He wound up winning a couple of Murrow Awards as a result of all this, because I took him along with Dennis and him, and those are the guys that I took with me everywhere that I went. He wound up getting nationally acclaimed awards as a result of his work on this case, which I felt like he deserved, because he's a guy who understood the perspective of history. I think a lot of the other people didn't really get what the historical significance of this is going to be. And how could it? Because, like I said, when everybody's dead in 100 years, you look back, hey, that was a historical moment in America, but you couldn't see that then. Heck, I was down here 3 days before I even knew what happened. I didn't even turn on the radio.
I want to thank you both. You're a great team.